Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Douglas and Sarah Allison Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website, those that will be sometime soon joining us on C-SPAN Book TV, and ask everyone here in-house if you'll be so kind to check that your cell phones have been turned off. All of the camera crews will be very grateful, to say nothing of the speaker. We will post the program within 24 hours on our website for everyone's future reference. And of course, our internet viewers are always welcome to send questions or comments, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. We're pleased to welcome back to Heritage Seth Cropsey, who served here as our Asian Studies Director in the 1990s. We, of course, have copies of his book, Mayday, available out in the foyer, and he will be available for signing them afterwards at your convenience. Hosting our guest today is Michaela Dodge, Policy Analyst, Defense and Strategic Policy in our Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies. She specializes in missile defense, nuclear weapons modernization, and arms control. She has authored and co-authored research papers and commentary for Heritage, as well as distributed defense and national security posts to Heritage policy blog, The Foundry. She's also appeared online in venues such as foxnews.com, The Daily Caller, and Big Piece. She holds her Master's of Science degree in Defense and Strategic Studies from Missouri State University. She received a bachelor's degree in International Relations and Defense and Strategic Studies from Masaryk University in the Czech Republic. She also serves as a National Security Fellow with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies and is a former Publius Fellow at the Claremont Institute. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Michaela Dodge. Michaela?
Thank you very much, John, and thank you everybody for coming to Heritage on this rainy day. Thank you for watching online. Also, feel free to tweet the event as we hear the remarks and go to the question and answer session. Use hashtag Naval Supremacy @Heritage. Now, we know that Department of Defense is facing sequestration, and impacts are going to be dire. It can shed as much as $500 billion from its budget in the next 10 years. The process threatens to undermine U.S. security. It has profound impacts for the services, including the Navy. The Navy, which is already stretched thin around the world, is in a dire need of modernization and would have to cut as many as 30 ships, if not more, under sequestration. All the while, our adversaries arm up. In U.S. strategic planning, China is a lot like Voldemort. Can we prepare for a danger that we do not name, that we do not often even think about? But fortunately, our distinguished guest today wrote a fantastic book. John showed it to you. And he spent a great deal of thinking about China and the future of Navy. He names the danger and lays out all the many ways in which we depend on U.S. Navy and U.S. naval supremacy. And that's very important because we've come to take that security and those benefits for granted. Sir, it's great pleasure to welcome you back to the Heritage Foundation. Mr. Cropsey is currently a senior fellow at the Hudson Institute. He began his career in the government at the Defense Department as assistant to the Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger. He served as Deputy Undersecretary of the Navy in the Reagan and Bush administrations. In his capacity, he was responsible for the Navy's position on effort to reorganize the DoD, development of the maritime strategy, the Navy's academic institutions, naval special operations, and burden sharing with NATO allies, and that's no easy task. In the Bush administration, Mr. Cropsey moved to OSD to become acting secretary, assistant secretary, and then principal deputy assistant secretary of defense for special operations and low-intensity conflict. From 1982 to 1984, Mr. Cropsey directed the editorial policy of the Voice of America on the Solidarity movement in Poland, Soviet treatment of dissidents, and other issues. In 2002, Mr. Cropsey served as director of the U.S. government's International Broadcasting Bureau. He supervised the agency's efforts that were undertaken to increase radio and television broadcasting to the Muslim world. Mr. Cropsey's work in the private sector includes reporting for Fortune magazine and as a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and director of the Heritage Foundation's Asia Study Center from 1991 to 1994. Sir, welcome again, and we're looking forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Michaela. It's a pleasure to be back, and ladies and gentlemen, and also my lovely wife, Mihaela, it's similar names. Delighted to be here. Mayday is an anglicized form of Mayday, French for help me. It's the international shorthand that mariners and aviators use to declare an emergency and request help. I chose this as the title for the book, which is the subject of this afternoon's event, because American sea power is in trouble. The last official statement of U.S. maritime strategy was published 6 years ago, with acknowledgement of U.S. sea power's traditional role as a nuclear and conventional deterrent, projecting power, responding to crises, showing the flag around the world. The 2007 strategy emphasized cooperation with other navies and humanitarian missions. These, the document said, would help prevent wars, a policy that I think is inconsistent with American foreign and military policy of the past, which has usually responded rather than anticipated conflict. More important, the Navy's 2007 strategy did not mention the word China, as you pointed out. Not once. Naval spokesmen have justified this oversight as a means of avoiding unnecessarily antagonizing China. Yet China has made it clear in word and deed that its policy is to deny the United States access to the Western Pacific. With U.S. access to the Western Pacific in doubt, our ability to honor our commitments to the 5 nations with which we have security treaties in East and Southeast Asia would be called into question. China is building a ballistic missile system intended to target large American vessels, read aircraft carriers, such underway at sea at a distance of up to 1,200 miles. China has conducted cyber attacks against the U.S. government as well as industry. It has declared that the international waters of the South and East China Seas lie within its sovereign grasp. Its military budget continues, as it has for over 2 decades, to increase by double-digit figures from year to year. It has built a formidable array of surface-to-surface and surface-to-air missiles and continues amassing an arsenal of these weapons immediately across the straits from Taiwan. Despite this administration's implicit shift from the Middle East wars it has drawn to a close, the Persian Gulf will remain volatile and dangerously so if Iran becomes a nuclear power. Some of you may have read the Washington-based Institute for Science and International Security report that was published on Tuesday this week. That predicted that Iran will be able to produce weapons-grade uranium by the middle of 2014 without being detected. In addition, as current events demonstrate, the Levant and Maghreb are in turmoil. Turkey has reversed direction and is pursuing Islamist domestic and foreign policies that are the equal of its Ottoman past. Syria is in the midst of a horrific civil war. We must rely on the Egyptian military's prudence to avoid a similar outcome in the Arab world's greatest state. And recent developments in Tunisia don't look promising either. The Eastern Mediterranean has reverted to the instability that characterized it for most of recorded history. And the U.S. Sixth Fleet, our Mediterranean naval force, which once included 2 carrier battle groups, consists today of a command ship based in Italy and 3 or so surface ships equipped with ballistic missile defenses. In the Mediterranean, the soft power that the Obama administration favors is in fact unsupported by hard power. Into the vacuum left by our departure, others are stepping. Iran has sent a frigate and a much larger helicopter carrier into the Mediterranean. China last year ordered a destroyer, a guided missile frigate, and a logistics vessel into the Med. And this year, at least up until now, has deployed 2 guided missile frigates, which have called at Algeria, Malta, Morocco, and France. Russia currently has 16 ships on station in the Med and plans a rotational schedule that will allow a permanent presence for now of 12 ships. Moscow is also seeking to reach a basing agreement with Cyprus that would allow Russian combat aircraft and vessels to use an airfield at Paphos in the western part of the island and at the southern port of Limassol. However, my point here, which is also noted in the book, is not so much to paint a picture of what I regard as troublesome military developments in the Mediterranean or even in China that affect us and our allies. It's rather to emphasize that contrary to the Navy's 2007 maritime strategy of preventing wars, neither U.S. naval nor national leadership has acknowledged that we are, in fact, in a strategic competition with China that requires diplomatic and military strategy, as well as the resources to support it. The rebalance to Asia, as the Obama administration terms it, does not clearly state what the objective of the rebalance is. If the rebalance is intended to counter growing Chinese military power in the region, the slight redistribution of U.S. naval forces away from the rest of the world and toward Asia that the administration has announced will not keep pace with China's arms buildup, won't keep peace either. And with nearly $500 billion already subtracted from the Defense Department in the first Obama administration, and the prospect that sequestration will remove an equal amount, where will the funds come from to build, deploy, and maintain a larger Pacific fleet in the future? A substantial portion of Mayday looks at the size of today's fleet and its prospects for growth in the future. But the prior question really is, to what end? I believe that our security is best served if we have a clear understanding of the strategy needed to secure our interests and those of our allies, but I don't think we do. Notwithstanding the question of the size of American sea power, the issue of the size of American sea power is quite serious. At the end of the Cold War, the U.S. combat fleet neared the goal that President Reagan set of 600 ships and 15 carrier battle groups. At approximately 285 ships, today's fleet is less than half that size. The goal of a 313 ship fleet toward which Navy had striven for the better part of the last decade has most recently been reduced to 306 ships. A three-star admiral, who up until his recent retirement was responsible for naval warfare systems, predicted that without the contingency funds that have helped sustain military operations throughout the Middle Eastern wars, the size of the fleet would decrease to approximately 195 ships over the next 30 years. Both the Congressional Research Service and the Congressional Budget Office identify large gaps between the Navy's estimates of what's needed to reach a 306 ship fleet and the actual ship costs, inflation, and likely available funding. The Navy is asking for $14 billion for shipbuilding this year, regardless of sequestration. At the same time, Navy acknowledges that a shipbuilding budget of $18.8 billion per year is needed for each of the next 30 years to reach a 306 ship fleet. Congress's research arms say that Navy underestimates the true cost by $3 billion per year over the same 30-year period. That's quite a large difference. And sequestration, as you know, is a big matter. Prior to its implementation, the Navy sought to trim costs by not deploying the Truman Carrier Battle Group to the Middle East. This leaves a single carrier battle group there as warning signals that Iran is approaching nuclear status increase. Navy tied up 7 surface combatants with many years of useful service life still left in them. The most direct way to save money is to reduce operations. Naval leadership accomplished this, reduced budget targets, but also diminished the distributed global presence of the U.S. combat fleet. In addition, several aircraft carrier wings' levels of training were reduced to minimum safe flying levels. This means that they would not be prepared for combat if there were a crisis. It would take time to prepare them. 4 supply ships that served the U.S. Pacific Command were laid up. And that's particularly important because of the Pacific's immensity and our commensurate need to resupply vessels on patrol in its furthest reaches. No supply, no operations. Other cost savings measures for the first year of sequestration included a reduction in the number of escort ships that accompany the Nimitz carrier battle group and an early return to port of a frigate assigned to the U.S. Southern Command, which is responsible, among other things, for staunching the flow of illegal drugs from South and Central America into the United States. For now, the Navy will fail to meet its readiness standards for 2/3 of its non-deployed ships and aviation squadrons. As Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Jonathan Greenert told Congress earlier this year, and this is a quote, "We will not be able to respond in the way the nation has expected and depended on us." In short, and that's the end of his quote. In short, the Navy will meet sequestration by operating less while extending the deployments of ships at sea, which, ironically, increases the cost of repairing them, and also by buying fewer ships in the future. This will cut readiness. It will reduce the presence of our globally distributed fleet over the short term, as it diminishes American sea power's ability to recover that presence in the future by simply depriving it of ships. There's no good news here. and history offers sober proof. The states that achieved great power by taking the best advantage of their proximity to the seas and then forgot or lost their dominant sea power never recovered it. Athens ignored Pericles' advice to preserve the security and commercial advantages of its sea power and lost both the Peloponnesian War and its great power status. In its search for resources on land to build and supply its powerful fleet, Venice became entangled in the internecine warfare of the Italian city-states, ignored the transformation of naval architecture from inland sea vessels to ocean-going hulls and propulsion, and alienated its carrying trade partners by overtaxing them. The glorious city that its sea power created remains, but the power that made it possible ended nearly 5 centuries ago. The Dutch used their merchant fleet to establish Europe's most vibrant economy and figured that their wealth, unprotected by naval force, or at least protected by a very small one, would suffice. They learned the hard way that wealth is no guarantor of peace. Holland's small naval force made relatively easy pickings for the English and lost, the Dutch lost, never to recover, the maritime source of their power. England, burdened by the unexpectedly high cost of the Boer War and the idea that government debt at any level was an evil, began to abandon its global presence even before World War I. Today, the Royal Navy has 19 surface combatants. That's less than a third of what it possessed as recently as the Falklands War. The likelihood that the British will reestablish their position as either a great power or a great maritime power is beyond my imagination. For a state whose greatness rests importantly on the economic and security benefits of seaborne trade, the ability to protect it, and alliances sustained by naval force, the evaporation of dominant sea power equals the loss of national greatness. And although my book did not cover this subject in detail, it's worth noting here that the gathering debate within the Republican Party over America's engagement with the world, including the resources to support such engagement, is an ominous sign, not only for those who see the connection between a powerful U.S. and a more democratic and safe world, but for the world itself. As Britain began to give up its global reach before World War I, an ascendant U.S. was there, gradually to don an important part of the discarded mantle. If those within the Republican Party who, for reasons different from President Obama's, triumph, America's retreat to less influence and less participation in the world will offer neither stability nor prosperity. There is no powerful democratic state in the sidelines waiting to assume our current responsibilities. There is China, a less engaged, less powerful, more inwards-looking America will diminish the international demand for American products. It will risk and ultimately sunder our leadership position in Europe and Asia. And it will give birth to a new international order, one in which liberty, free markets, human rights, respect for territorial sovereignty, and freedom of navigation on the high seas are not priorities. I don't think any of us want to see this happen. And here, returning to the central theme of my book, I think that there are many steps we can take to prevent and reverse naval decline. This would mean acknowledging the importance of the strategic competition in which we find ourselves opposite China, while also emphasizing the importance of the Middle East and hemispheric defense. Such a declaration of priorities would help answer questions about the size and character of the U.S. fleet, and these questions continue to dog us today. The second step is greater discipline in the design and construction of naval vessels. Cost overruns have been a problem in recent years when we have seen the expense of the Navy's newest carrier greatly exceed original contractual obligation. The Navy's new destroyer met the same problems and the program was largely canceled. The littoral combat ship experienced similar issues initially, and the modular systems that allow the same littoral combat ship to perform different combat missions have yet to be built and deployed, and who knows, paid for. Similar accountability is needed throughout the entire Defense Department, whose organization for procurement is heavily centralized and looks like a relic of the Soviet Union. In general, the Office of the Secretary of Defense bureaucracy is huge, unwieldy, and unnecessarily expensive. It should be reduced, it should be made accountable, and key roles should be returned to the military services. At the same time, those parts of the 1986 legislation known as Goldwater-Nichols should be changed to reestablish the military service chief's responsibility for their service's strategic vision. This has largely migrated to the Office of the Secretary of Defense and the Joint Staff, Joint Chiefs. As Professor Samuel Huntington of Harvard, who died just a few years ago, observed in his famous 1954 article in Proceedings, military services that do not have a clear view of their strategic raison d'etre, he said, become purposeless and wallow about amid a variety of conflicting and confusing goals and ultimately suffer both physical and moral degeneration, end of quote. We should also move away from the political correctness of dividing the defense budget more or less equally among the military services. The 1986 legislation encouraged this, but it was not always so. President Eisenhower divided the military budget quite unevenly during the 1950s as he sought to improve the nation's nuclear deterrent, a mission in which the Army did not participate as extensively as the Air Force. I don't think I will surprise anybody here by saying that I'm pessimistic about the immediate future for our armed services and for the Navy in particular. But over the long run, I don't think that Americans have become isolationist. I don't believe that our fellow citizens would like to have a military that is second to any in the world. The question is whether we will, as a nation, realize the stakes soon enough to take effective corrective action. I wrote Mayday to encourage the national discussion that I believe is needed to make these choices deliberately, consciously, not by default. And I'm happy to speak here this afternoon at Heritage, not only to return, but because I think we share the same goal. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions, aren't I?
Yes.
Okay.
Please wait for the microphone. State your name and affiliation, and please ask questions. Don't give sermons, so that we can get to as many as possible. Thank you very much. Sir.
Thank you. I'm Dick Kaufman, and I'm a civilian. I mean, I have no affiliation other than several years in the Marine Corps and the CIA. My question is your view of the vulnerability of carrier battle groups to as you mentioned, the Chinese missile threat. I know there's, and I'm sure you're aware, there's a lot of debate going on about carrier battle groups and their future. What is your view?
You mean, what is my view about the vulnerability?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, China tested that missile I referred to, which is called the DF-21, in the spring. Maybe it was early in the summer, late spring, something like that. But it was a test on land. They declared it a successful test. I expect that other tests will follow at sea and eventually on a moving target. I don't know whether they're going to succeed, but if I had to bet, I think they probably will. You don't have to hit the target on the first shot. It's not like it's one weapon and that's it. You can send 20 of them. What is a ballistic missile cost compared to a large aircraft carrier with a full air wing aboard it? So we're going to have to. 15 or 20 years ago, if somebody had suggested that China would be developing such a device, I think most people in the military would say, you must be out of your mind. But I think today people are taking it much more seriously. So I think it's a real threat, and that doesn't mean the end. Military history is, as you know, is this goes on, and then that answers it. So we'll have to respond in some form or another. There are all kinds of things that can be done. Defenses against a ballistic missile can be produced. It's difficult, but not impossible. The range of planes that would conduct surveillance and combat missions can be extended, but of course their answer to that would be to extend the range of the ballistic missile. So it's a problem. We're going to have to deal with it in one form or another, and I take the threat seriously. Does that answer?
Yes.
Thank you. A reporter from the Voice of America. I'm just wondering, you're not. I do not think you do think that China threat is imminent, because I read something that said it takes years for China to reach the level of U.S. Navy now. So what's your view here? Thank you.
I didn't hear it.
Sorry, I was saying that I do not think you do really think that Chinese Navy is the China threat is imminent, and it takes years for China to reach the level of U.S. Navy now, right?
Today, I don't think that anybody in the PLA or TLA, in the Chinese military or the Chinese naval part of Chinese military. Can you hear me? Today, I don't think that there'd be much of a contest between the U.S. Navy and the Chinese Navy. I'm concerned about what things are going to look like 30 years from now, or even 20 years from now. Because if you combine sequestration with the budget cuts that have already taken place, and even more important than that, those are signs of the American public's sort of kind of forgetting the importance of naval power. If that forgetfulness is extended and we're not reminded how important the dominance at sea is, I think that the long-term trend is very serious for the United States, because China is modernizing its fleet. It's building a larger one. They have an aircraft carrier now that they didn't have a year ago at sea. It's going to take them time to learn how to operate it effectively and safely. There are plans for a second one. A lot of our senior officers are saying, well, it's only 2. Well, it's only 2 today, but try to think about what things will look like 3 decades from now. The Navy's responsible for doing that. It has to report to Congress on where it's going to be 30 years from now. And the reason that I pointed out the difference between the Navy's estimates of what it will take to reach a reduced fleet and Congress's estimates is exactly the answers your point, which is we're not getting to where we need to go. We're going in the opposite direction. And if this ends up in a situation where the United States is required to pull its ships from everywhere else in the world in order to deter or convince China that it's not a good idea to think about going to war with the United States, we've done the British thing. We're no longer a dominant global power. We can only apply force in one place in particular when it's necessary. That's what I'm concerned about. It's the future.
Thank you very much. I'm Jeffrey Lynn from Senator Angus King's office. And my question, sir, is regarding the sort of fast pace of technological change. Because, for instance, as you rightly pointed out, the Navy has to institute better discipline in its shipbuilding and design practice. But on the other hand, how can we balance that with the need to make bets on future technologies that could be game changers in naval warfare? Thank you very much.
Designing and building new technology does not equal cost overruns. One of the major reasons for cost overruns is, and perhaps the most significant one is, you decide you're going to build a particular ship, like the littoral combat ship, right? Or the new carrier into which new combat systems are being engineered for the first time. And as you're building the ship, one or two or 10 or 100 of your secondary, your prime contractor or your secondary contractors, the people you do business with, come along and say, hey, I have a better idea for doing this than the one that we had originally agreed to. It's going to cost you a little bit more. And if you say, okay, let's do it once, no problem. If you say it 1,000 times, big problem. So being disciplined about answering exactly those issues would be a large step forward in introducing the cost discipline that I'm talking about into a system that has had trouble maintaining it over the years. It does not mean that we are not able to that we're not able to take advantage of rail guns or electronically launched catapults. I mean, it's unfortunately a matter sort of being nibbled to death by ducks. You know, there's another idea, is an idea here, another idea here, another idea here. You add all those up, and you have, an $860 million overrun on an aircraft carrier. If you say no, just say no.
Al Millikenea Media. The acts of international piracy, what more would you say about the U.S. Navy and other national Navy responses to that?
I think that the initial responses to piracy off the Horn of Africa were appropriate. They were useful. It seems to me, though, that the merchant marine, that the merchants running ships who've trained their crews and armed some of them have been at least as effective as naval force. I mean, it's a huge area that the pirates have operated in. And if we put half the Navy, our Navy, into the area there, we still couldn't guarantee safety. I think the measures that have been taken by the shipping companies have been at least as successful as naval action in decreasing the piracy incidents off the Horn of Africa.
Next question.
Colonel Friedman, I'm U.S. Army. Just regarding technology and the advances in technology, both air and sea, I was wondering how that affected the final projected number of how many ships we need, and what's your projection of what we need as far as a number? I know you talked about 306 and 311, but what do you think the ideal number should be?
Well, there's the Quadrennial Defense Review, right, the QDR. And by congressional requirement, there's the answer to the QDR is required. A different point of view is required. And the most recent one recommended a fleet of 350 ships. I think that's a sensible. Figure. It would allow the United States to maintain at least a three-hub Navy based on a presence in the Western Pacific, in the Middle East, and in this hemisphere. I think that's the most sensible approach. We don't need a 600-ship Navy today. There is some truth that there is truth in the assertion that increasing technology diminishes the need for a large fleet. But it's not a if you look at this as a calculus problem, it turns into insanity. I mean, if you could, for example, put the entire combat power of the Navy into one ship, do you want to do that? No, because one ship can't be in three places, or can't be in two places at once. So 350 is, I think, about the right number. That might decrease as technology improves. I mean, for example, if we start producing, we're talking about naval guns that, with the assist of rocket power, could have a range of up to 200 miles. Well, if you can do 200 miles and you could make that 2,000 miles, it's kind of hard to imagine, but tell Captain Isaac Hull of the Constitution that ships of the U.S. Navy would be able to fire shells 200 miles, and he'd say, you must be nuts. So who knows? But for today, with today's technology, I think 350 is the right number.
Next question.
Hi, my name's Catherine Orm, and I'm from Executive Leadership Group. My question is about when you were discussing the steps to prevent and reverse the trend of the Navy decline. You talked about greater discipline in costs and design of vessels. And I'm curious if you have some more actionable items or more that you could discuss on what we might do about the problem.
Um, Maybe somebody here has a little bit better memory than I do, but sometime within the past 2 or 3 months, the Navy landed an unmanned aerial vehicle aboard an aircraft carrier. And it wasn't done by a sailor with a joystick somewhere on the ship or somewhere else. It was done by machines, by computers. Drones are not cheap, but they certainly can reduce costs because you don't have to have people flying them, and people are expensive to pay and provide benefits for, and berths on ships and spaces to live and eat and sleep and so on. So drones, unmanned vehicles, both in the air, on the surface, and underwater, are one possible solution that will save money. Does an aircraft carrier need to be as big as the ones that we're building today, especially when they're, at least for the foreseeable future, going to be vulnerable to ballistic missiles, or there's a good chance that they'll be vulnerable to ballistic missiles? Probably not. Could a smaller aircraft carrier be effective? I think so. Would it be better to have 3 smaller carriers than 1 big carrier? Well, for us it would. For an enemy that has to redistribute its forces, so it has to cover 3 ships instead of 1, and that's not a good thing at all. So that's another possibility. Do we need to keep building only nuclear-powered submarines? They're quite expensive, billions of dollars. They're not as quiet as diesel-electric submarines. There's new technology coming online, has been for decades coming online, that allows submarines to operate independently of air. Are those cheaper than nuclear submarines? Yes. Again, the same question with aircraft carriers. Would it be better if we had 3 or 4 diesel electric or other than nuclear powered submarines? From our point of view, it would be better. From a potential enemy's point of view, that means they have to deal with 4 submarines instead of 1. So I think those are some of the examples of things that we could do that would increase our combat effectiveness and likely diminish costs. Does that answer your question? Good.
Stan Sienkiewicz. I once worked in OSD when it was much simpler and smaller, and I certainly share your preference. Can you keep a substantial piece of a fleet operational with substantial use of reservists? Reservists, reconfigured, redesigned, but reserves, not full-time, 24/7, 365 troops.
You mean rely more on reserves?
Yes, and dramatic.
Well, I like the idea. I was a reserve officer, and my experience is that the reserves, when properly called on, can be very effective. There's sort of an ancient prejudice against the reserves, and I don't see that changing. I mean, you can never tell because you don't know what sort of events are going to take place in the future. If really pressed, the country would, I think, rethink it, or the political leadership would rethink that and insist that the reserves be used more in keeping with their potential and their demonstrated capabilities. But there's such a powerful institutional resistance to that in the, I mean, I just, a little story to illustrate something that I know you know, but maybe others are not quite aware of to illustrate the point. A few years ago, when I was at the American Enterprise Institute, and the Quadrennial Defense Review was being conducted, a now retired admiral would call me at AEI and say, could you come over and do a think session and sort of criticize the Navy's part of the QDR? And so I said, sure. Okay. So I went over, and there were several other people, and the admiral would brief, and we would take pot shots at it and whatnot. And the third or fourth time he called, I said, Joe, I happen to work for you. He said, what do you mean? And he said, I said, I'm in your reserve, work for you in reserve capacity on the weekends. You can have me free there. Never. He wanted this. My advice wouldn't have been any different, but it's hard to overcome that. Yeah.
And last question.
Hi, Danny Wall. Danny Walsh, Senator Coates' office. You mentioned the last maritime strategy's emphasis on cooperation with other navies. Does the recent Panamanian seizure of those that Cuban material on the North Korean ship, can you shed any light on that as far as what it means for our own Navy?
No, I can't. But I can tell you that that the Southern Command's Navy to Navy and special operations to special operations partnerships are a very high priority of the Southern Command, and they take it very seriously. They take it even more seriously than thinking about what do you do with those partnerships once you've established them. How do you use them to accomplish they're not goals in themselves, they're intended to facilitate other goals. But I don't know about the Panamanian case, but I do know that Southcom takes that the issue of partnership building very, very seriously.
Thank you very much. Thank you for coming, and please join me for a round of applause.